Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. A slightly abbreviated version of the 2021 F1 car analysis video today, looking this time at the Mercedes W12, the car with the biggest target on its back, the one that everyone's been desperate to see, to get their eyes on, and desperate to overhaul as the season unfolds. But the reason it's an abbreviated version is twofold. Firstly, I'm in a hotel room this evening, so I'm squeezing this into a very small gap in my schedule. And secondly, something that's become very apparent over the early part for the first few cars that have been launched and has been backed up with what we've seen today with the Mercedes W12 is that nobody's really revealing their full hand at this stage. Now that's really quite common under normal circumstances, but even more so this year. And the main reason for that is that with the regulations carrying over in some large degree with lots of the homologated areas of the car, that means that the areas available for development are much smaller. The window around that car, the technical window to improve and modify and change things from what you had last year, is quite a narrow one. It can be different on each car, but all development is being focused onto some very small areas, and that means because we know roughly what those small areas are going to be, people are being cagey about what they release into the world at this stage. And that was backed up today at the Mercedes launch, where James Allison quite openly and quite refreshingly honestly said that, look, we're hiding some stuff here. The details around the edge of the rear of the floor, one of the areas that we know has been heavily impacted by regulation change, they simply had some blank covers over that section to quite blatantly hide it from the opposition. And he quite frankly said, we don't want to give this away until the last minute. We don't have to, and so we've chosen not to. So there are definitely some things that we can't analyse around this car, and as we've seen some of the others too. But having said that, there are some areas that we can take a closer look at, and it's those that I want to have a quick look at today, starting at the front end. I think it's a good looking car. I like the livery, but ultimately any car that's fast ends up tending to look good, and no matter how it looks in terms of its clothes, its livery, its appearance, if it's slow, it'll end up being an absolute dog. This one, I don't think it's going to turn out that way. They've got a great basis to start from. They haven't lost their talent. They've got two great drivers that we know, an amazing team behind them, a really strong power unit that they've only improved on for this year. So there's nothing to suggest that this car should not be right at the front of the grid and favourite and the one that everyone else wants to be. Looking at the front end, it looks very, very similar in many, many ways to the one that left off in 2020. In 2020, they openly said that we'd stop development really early on in the season to focus on the 2021 car. Now that's a bold claim. Alright, they had a huge advantage in 2020 and had the luxury of being able to take resource away from what was then the current campaign, knowing that the points advantage they had over everybody else and how far behind the competition were, they had no major threat from outside of their own team. But it has meant they've been able to refine the car in a number of areas, having put a lot of focus on it. We think, although this hasn't yet been confirmed by the team, that they've spent their 2 development tokens allowed in the regulations this year on the front end. Notably, or particularly, we think the suspension around the inboard area. Now, of course, we can't see any of that, but it will centre around things like rockers, dampers, all of the internal suspension components that sit just behind the nose, right in the front of the chassis, just ahead of where the driver's feet are inside the car. The actual suspension components actually look very similar, if not identical, to the ones that left off last season. One notable area that's definitely changed on this launch spec render is the brake ducts. Now, Mercedes have been quite pioneering in leading the way in this idea of capturing airflow coming off the front wing into the brake ducts here. Now, in the old days, that was all simply used to channel in towards the brakes to cool them, hence the name brake ducts. But actually in recent times, and Mercedes have been at the forefront of this, a lot of this airflow, and that's part of the reason why this has been changed and why they've become so complex now, is this is capturing a lot of the airflow coming off these front wings, perhaps off the underside of the front wing too, with this new profiled lower section. And some of it, of course, still goes to feed those brakes, to cool the brakes that run at massive temperatures on certain circuits. But a lot of that airflow is actually being fed straight in through the brake ducts and channeled out through the centre of the wheel to be used as a powerful stream of airflow directed well away from the car I've talked about this in so many videos now, but that idea of dragging away some of that messy, turbulent tyre wake that spins and spirals off the back of these rotating tyres is a really important part of allowing the rear end of the car to function properly, to be functioning in the most efficient manner. Channeling high-speed airflow cleanly through the centre of the wheel directly out as it comes out of this exit of the wheel rim, of course with the flow of the car moving forward, with the flow moving in a rearwards trajectory in comparison to the car, it drags that high-powered stream coming out of here, drags it out rearwards and away from the car, and that in turn draws with it a lot of that messy, turbulent tyre wake that we don't want anywhere near the other critical components. So that's definitely an area that I have been spending some time on, working on over the course of the season. The rest of it looks very similar. The front wing the same, the cape underneath the nose at this point looks very similar. As we move further back, hugely complicated barge boards, which definitely have changed at this stage, but like some of those other areas, that's something that will be an intense area of development for them and for all of the teams, so really do expect that to change as time goes on and we start seeing the car hit the racetrack. Part of the reason the barge boards are continuously changing is, well, partly because they're always after continuous improvement, and this is a really crucial and critical area to maximising the performance of some of the other areas of the car. But because they've put so much work, and this is one of the areas we really can see from this, and that James Allison also talked about in the launch today, they've reprofiled so much of this rear bodywork, the side pod, with a really aggressive and steep undercut underneath where the engine and gearbox sit in towards that Coke bottle area there. Because that section has changed its profile so much, of course the patterns of airflow over that are going to be completely different too. And because a lot of the furniture from the front wing forwards to the front of the floor to the barge boards, because they all have to work in conjunction with each other, if you're changing the flow structures towards the rear of the car, you have to change all of these really detailed components around the barge boards that lead on to those side pods and contours around the floor and the side pod undercut. So it's no doubt, no wonder that they have been working hard in those areas, but also because it's such a crucial area and because we've had big regulation changes that Mercedes kept very secret today around this section of the floor just in front of the rear tyres, a lot of the downforce that's been lost, a lot of the capability for producing downforce that's been lost by this regulation change and others around the rear of the diffuser that I've talked about in other videos, because of that loss, they've had to look at other areas to try and recoup some of that lost performance. The barge boards could be a really crucial area for regaining some of that. So expect huge amount of work in that area for these guys and all of the teams. Part of what Mercedes looked to have done with this reprofile is gone for a really steep sloping section off the back of the side pod inlet here. Now just inside that, where you can see the highlight of that white line behind the Petronas logos there, that's roughly where the radiators, the cooling radiators, will sit inside the side pod. They're sitting at an angle, they're sloped down towards the rear. But what we've seen on this car, perhaps more so than we've seen before, is a really steep, aggressive undercut off the back of the airflow hitting the leading edge of this side pod. Some of it of course will go into the inlet of the side pod, others will spill over the top, others will come around the side, managed by all of that furniture around the barge boards. But over the top of here, the Coanda effect, that phenomenon that we became so used to in the exhaust blown diffuser days, where we exited the exhaust pipes around here and used the Coanda effect to get the airflow to follow a really curved surface and direct it in towards the exhaust, or the top of the diffuser, when using things like fins and little guiding vanes became banned. We had to rely on the Coanda effect, this phenomenon that says it will follow the contours of a surface. You can only do that to so much of an extent before, if you go too steeply around a curve at the wrong velocity, at the wrong speed, the airflow will detach and it will become spiral and messy and turbulent, and therefore you'll have a negative effect. But what Mercedes has done is gone with a very steep flow, a steep contour down here, trying to encourage the flow over the top of that inlet at this stage, the leading edge, following the flow down, following the contours down this slope under here and getting the flow into this area. Now, one of the effects that we've lost by trimming back the floors with the regulation down here, losing a lot of the slots and the furniture in that area is the ability to seal off the diffuser. Seal off the powerful effect on the underside of the car where we get that low pressure airflow running very fast underneath the car, generating downforce at the diffuser. Now, because these tyres are spinning, they're bouncing, they are an aerodynamicist's nightmare, a lot of the flow, or the tyre squirt that we became used to, that strange term, used to squirt from the tyre making contact with the road surface. The airflow would squirt out in all directions, of course, at this point here. Some would come out this way, but other parts or other areas of that flow would squirt into the underside of the car. Now, when that happens, you massively detract from the power or the performance of your diffuser. The old way the floor used to look played a huge part in forming an almost virtual barrier, if you like, of airflow between the tyre and the diffuser to seal it off. Having lost that, I think a lot of the teams now are trying to use effects like this, big powerful undercuts under here, to get as much high-speed flow into this area and maybe have some kind of similar effect. Trying to get that powerful flow to form a barrier, to form a shield or a channel between the tyre and the diffuser, albeit in a very different way than we used to do it before. Probably nowhere near as effective as the way we used to be able to do it with the floor, but perhaps regaining something of that lost performance that the regulations have tried to curtail. We can definitely see that the bodywork has been shrink wrapped over the Mercedes power unit underneath. We can see that because there are protrusions. There's a big bulge in here, which is just a component that's underneath that bodywork that the bodywork has had to shrink over. Now, of course, slimming the whole thing down brings aerodynamic gain, but on the inside of that, you lose a lot of the cooling capability. You lose the ability to have airflow and space underneath that bodywork for components to breathe, to release heat. It gets incredibly hot under this zone, and therefore, when you shrink bodywork down, you then run into potential problems with components overheating. Components even catching fire, I've known in the past, when they become too close to an exhaust without any cooling airflow going between those components. Obviously Mercedes have thought of all of this, but that's one of the challenges that comes with really shrink wrapping your bodywork over all of those very hot components underneath. But clearly a lot of work gone on to that area, that zone, into making it as slim as possible, making it aerodynamically efficient, and also using these new contours, this really big undercut. I talked about a steep slope here. There's also a really steep slope underneath that side pod, to channel the flow in the underside of that car in towards the Coke bottle, the area just above the gearbox or above the diffuser, because the more flow, or the more high-speed flow we can drive out over the top of the back of the diffuser, we can help draw more flow through the diffuser and therefore generate more downforce. Again, something that's been impacted heavily by the regulation changes for 2021. So, some interesting work. Little really to be able to talk about in terms of things we can see, but the things we can see show that the team have made incremental gains in a number of different areas that they've been allowed to work on. The regulations for 2021 allow almost complete freedom in terms of the aerodynamic surfaces, and Mercedes, like everybody, have taken full advantage of continuing to work, continuing to improve on and adapt a lot of those aero surfaces around every part of the bodywork and the car, and that will only continue through the early part of this season. At some stage, as we know, everyone's going to be switching resource over towards the 2022 car, at which point development on the 2021 cars will very quickly grind to some kind of halt, and there will be a slight race on there in who's going to pull the trigger first, who's going to switch over to 22 and almost abandon 2021 earliest, who's going to have the capability to go on a bit longer to keep that fight alive. It will very much depend on where you are in the season, how competitive you are, how close you are to your competitors. But who blinks first could have a big impact on the outcome of this championship.